The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, scholar Pedro Noguera explains why teachers' strikes matter to our democracy. Author Eric Liu calls on all of us to find our power to fight for change. And Bill Press talks with Bernie Sanders' former campaign manager about his new book, How Bernie Won. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Urban sociologist Pedro Noguera writes about the intersection of education and social justice. He says the wave of teachers' strikes across the country are galvanizing the movement for workers' rights and setting the stage for a more equitable democracy. And we say hello to Pedro Noguera, an urban sociologist and a distinguished professor of education at the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. He is the author of numerous books, including the most recent, Race, Equity, and Education, The Pursuit of Equality in Education 60 Years After Brown. Pedro Noguera, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us. You recently wrote an article for The Nation titled, What's at Stake in the Teachers' Strikes? And in it, you explain what is driving teachers to action. What are some of the more immediate conditions that teachers are dealing with?
Well, we can't generalize because this issue is predominantly an issue in Republican states that have systematically underfunded schools for the last several years, particularly since the recession. And that's what we've seen in places like West Virginia and Colorado and Arizona, where they have just neglected the schools. And in Oklahoma, you literally have kids going to schools 4 days a week. Teacher salaries have not kept pace, so teachers are constantly trying to leave the profession or leave the state because they can't get paid well enough, and are barely making it. And so these strikes are very much in response to this underfunding of public education.
In terms of a larger context, you identify a so-called reform movement directed at public education over recent years. Who are these modern-day reformers, and what has been their impact on public education?
Well, even the reform movement looks different in different places. In some places it's been led by Democrats. Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, until recently was a big proponent of charter schools and of judging teachers by student test scores. But in a lot of the states, Jeb Bush has been in that camp in Florida when he was the governor there. And what it generally comes down to is policies that have made the job of a teacher much less attractive. You think about teaching is such a taxing profession, taxing psychologically and emotionally, and it's not a profession where you're going to earn a lot of money. Although there are teachers who've been teaching for 20, 25 years whose salaries are certainly respectable. But in the first few years, teachers are usually underpaid. And if you live in a big city like San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles, the salary is not even enough to find adequate housing. And so what we've seen is that lots of high turnover in teachers because people are not making it, and the conditions they work under have increasingly deteriorated. And so what we've seen is teaching as a profession become much, much less attractive, and it's had an impact on kids. And it's ironic because, supposedly the reformers have been trying to improve education, but many of the policies they've advocated have actually had the opposite effect.
Mm-hmm. You make the important observation that many of the recent teachers' strikes are taking place in red or right-to-work states. You suggest that teachers could be at the forefront of a major comeback by organized labor. What would that look like?
Well, I think that we're seeing it in the red states now, that teachers demanding, as they did in West Virginia, better pay, And not just better pay, better conditions. Because, in Oklahoma, they were offered a bump in salary. Same thing in Kentucky. And they held out. They held out because they know that if you improve the salary, but you don't improve the work conditions, the conditions in schools, they're still being shortchanged. So I give the teachers a lot of credit for really standing firm in defense of public education, not simply in defense of their salaries and benefits.
I actually saw a teacher at one of the rallies that we've seen around the country recently, and her whole point was, this is not about my salary. This is about being able to have the tools that I need to teach the kids. So you can pay me extra money, but I still got to go out and buy my own materials for my children. That's just not right.
That's right. I mean, Los Angeles, we have classrooms of 38, 40 students in a classroom. That's not an optimal learning environment for kids, and it's certainly not for teachers. So the conditions that teachers are working under really are critical to the kind of education we provide to our students.
We're speaking with Pedro Noguera, an urban sociologist and a distinguished professor of education at the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA, author of the latest book, Race, Equity, and Education, The Pursuit of Equality in Education, 60 Years After Brown. As often happens, Pedro, when teachers take action, they are labeled as not doing what's right for kids. In fact, Education Secretary Betsy DeVos actually suggested that adults should keep adult disagreements and disputes in a separate place. What's wrong with this way of thinking?
Well, easy for her to say. Betsy DeVos is a billionaire. Betsy DeVos has not spent time in public schools, and she herself said on a recent interview on 60 Minutes she'd never been to an underperforming school, which is actually shocking for someone who holds the office she holds. I don't think she's in a position to talk about what teachers are dealing with. If she were to listen to teachers, if she would have visited some of those underperforming schools, and she could just literally walk a mile or two from her office in Washington to find some, she would see conditions that she would never put her own children under. And that, to me, speaks to what's wrong. Those with the most power are the least accountable. They talk about accountability, but they don't practice it. And they certainly don't ensure that the people doing the hard work get the support they need to get the job done.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that often happens when teachers strike is an attack on teachers' unions. And you say this may not be an effective tactic anymore. What suggests that may be the case?
Well, I think the teachers are very well aware that in the non-union states, the salaries are a lot lower and the conditions are a lot worse. And if you look at places, our highest performing states are heavily unionized. Massachusetts is the top performing state. Those teachers are all in unions. And so the idea that unions have undermined education is not borne out by the facts. In fact, when unions work best, they're not only advocating for teachers, but they're advocating for children and for schools. And so I think that the teachers in the so-called right-to-work states, where there are no unions, recognize that they're at a huge disadvantage and are pushing for rights that will guarantee that their job status improves.
Are there things that just everyday citizens should or could be doing in support of teachers? I mean, obviously the teachers have kind of raised up the dust on this whole thing most recently, but are there other things that other people could do to say, hey, look, we need to change this? And it's pretty obvious because there are a lot of numbers that say our education system is not doing what it should be doing.
I think that they're going to have to continue. What concerns me is as we see this wave is, will it be sustained? I felt for a long time that the teachers, and I would say by extension parents, are the kind of sleeping giant in public education that we don't hear from. We hear from the politicians, we hear from the business community, we don't hear from the people who rely on the system, parents and teachers, and they need to speak up because we've allowed the quality of education to deteriorate rapidly, particularly in poor communities, at a time when we should be using education to expand opportunity and to address problems like poverty. And I think that teacher unions are the best position to be the advocates for those children who are so disadvantaged at this time.
Mm-hmm. Now, the subtitle of your article in The Nation says that the fight over the future of public education is a fight over the future of American democracy. In thinking about the larger mission of education in its relationship to equity in a democracy, What are the issues you'd like to see at the center of a true reform movement?
I think that we have so many issues. We have to make sure that all kids who need it have access to adequate food, decent health care. These are ultimately educational issues because hungry kids don't do well in school, and teachers who are working in schools where kids don't have adequate housing and health care are seeing the effects. We have to also make sure that the schools they go to are safe, that they're orderly, that they're well supported, that they have access to counselors and school nurses. These are basic rights that should be guaranteed. We are one of few countries in the world, industrialized countries, that does not guarantee access to quality preschool. This is outrageous because we've known for many years that early childhood education is one of the best things we could do to fight poverty. So my hope is that the agenda that teachers pursue will be an ambitious one that's not, again, that focus on the kind of schools America needs to address the huge problems that we face.
The name of his most recent book, Race, Equity, and Education, The Pursuit of Equality in Education, 60 Years After Brown. And the author, Pedro Noguera, an urban sociologist and a distinguished professor of education at the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA, has joined us here today on americasdemocrats.org. Professor, we appreciate your time with us today and do look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, author Eric Liu on the bottom-up movement for change that is redefining power in America. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
The Koch brothers' extremist political agenda of empowering multinational corporations to reign as sovereigns over the majority will of the people has always been inextricably entwined with the profiteering agenda of their wholly owned $100 billion a year industrial conglomerate. The brothers' plutocratic view of business as government even has a name, Pompeo, as in Mike Pompeo, the Trump regime's latest Secretary of State. Years ago, while living in the billionaire brothers' hometown of Wichita, Kansas, Mike got lucky when they pumped a load of Koch capital into a business he had started, turning him into a millionaire. Then they partnered with him in another business that essentially made him a Koch Industries subsidiary. In 2010, they turned this business asset they'd created into a political asset, providing the money from Koch PAC and the backing of their right-wing front group to elect Pompeo to serve as the congressman from Koch. The brothers even installed a Koch Industries lobbyist to run his congressional office. So Mike's been a loyal Koch head, conferring with them and backing bills to advance their corporate and political fortunes. Their investment in Mike became a bonanza last year when he became Trump's yes man as the head of the CIA. And now they've hit the political jackpot, with Pompeo becoming head of the State Department. On everything from international oil deals that profit multinational giants like Koch Industries to supporting the brothers' relentless opposition to all global efforts that would restrict fossil fuel profiteers from causing more climate change. The Koch's personal political insider is now their global corporate asset. This is Jim Hightower saying, to keep up with how Mike converts Koch-headed corporatism into U.S. foreign policy, go to www.prwatch.org/topics/Koch-exposed.
If you like these feisty pops of populism that Hightower zings out on the airwaves, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter provides the in-depth lowdown on what the greed heads of Wall Street and the boneheads of Washington are doing to us behind the scenes. With Hightower's saucy Texas humor and truth-telling populist perspective, the lowdown literally can lift you up. And get this, you can have the lowdown delivered to your mailbox or email each month for only $15 a year. Yes, 12 issues, only $15. Check it out, hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Eric Liu has spent a career practicing and teaching civic power. In his latest book, he explains how each of us can take action to make lasting change. And we say hello to Eric Liu, founder and CEO of Citizen University, and served as deputy assistant to President Clinton for domestic policy between 1999 and 2000. He is the author of numerous books, including Imagination First, Unlocking the Power of Possibility, and The Accidental Asian, Notes of a Native Speaker. His most recent book is titled You're More Powerful Than You Think, A Citizen's Guide to Making Change Happen. Eric Liu, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Jim, it's great to be with you.
And our pleasure to have you with us. You know, one of the things you write about and talk about is the very definition of power, something you think many of us get wrong, that we are, in fact, illiterate when it comes to power. What is your definition of power and its core principles?
Well, I define power simply as the capacity to ensure that others do as you would have them do. And to many people, that blunt definition is very off-putting, or it seems awkwardly impolite to be so direct and to name it. But if we're honest, all of us as humans, this is not a left-right thing. All of us all the time are trying to get others to do as we would like them to do. And I think one of the things that in American life, and probably more on the left than the right, there is a bit of an allergy to talking about power that candidly, to naming it. And the problem with being avoidant about power is that when you are willfully ignorant about it, when you are willfully declining to name it and to be direct about it, you're ceding the field to people who are very happy to go whole hog and understand exactly what power is and to name it and to claim it and to grab it. And so I think one of the most basic things in this book and in our work at Citizen University that we try to emphasize is if you have any qualms about naming and talking about power, get over it. This is a time in our country's history where there is so much bottom-up change happening. And it just behooves all of us actually to get comfortable naming, claiming, and talking about power in civic life.
Well, and you've also said that many of us, including activists, are uncomfortable with the idea of power. Why would that be the case?
Well, I think it's probably less true for activists than it is for what I think of as interested bystanders in American civic life, right? I mean, sure. There are people who are part of the Black Lives Matter movement or part of the Fight for 15 or who are dreamers and their allies. They are feeling in their bones and in their work on the streets and in kind of legislative halls, they're feeling the contours of power and they're understanding, with every direct action and form of advocacy, how to change the game and the story and the equation of power. But there's a far, far greater number of people who are interested bystanders, who are following what's going on roughly in the news, who understand that this president poses a menace to norms of self-government and to institutions of a democratic republic. But they're just watching. And part of their watching is is driven by the sense of, well, I don't know where to begin. I don't know what I would do. I don't know how to get involved. The game is so rigged anyway. Why would I bother to participate, right? And my view is that though the game may be rigged, the belief that there's no point in me participating because people are just going to take advantage of me anyway is one of the most self-fulfilling beliefs that's possible in civic life. right? And so if you think you're powerless, you pretty much ensure that it's so. Now, the converse isn't necessarily true. It's not that if you think you're powerful, you suddenly become powerful, but it begins with recognizing how much of your voice, how much of your capacity, how much of your ability to organize other people and organize money and mobilize ideas, how much of that we're giving away every single day, right? And I think that's particularly true, again, for the broad swath of Americans who are interested bystanders. And our work at Citizen University and this book are fundamentally directed at getting people off the sidelines and to recognize that I got to stop giving away my power, and I got to start claiming it. I got to start learning how to practice it, and that means understanding what forms it takes and what laws it follows and how we actually make change.
You know, your book, of course, as I mentioned, is titled "You're More Powerful Than You Think," and it comes at a time when many Americans do feel powerless. Why is that happening? I mean, is it hasn't there always been sort of a sense of, well, that person's in charge, they know what to do, and we all just sort of follow along? I mean, this kind of goes way, way back in time, doesn't it?
Well, to an extent, of course, but I think it's particularly heightened right now because we're coming to that point of critical mass of 4 decades or so of just grinding, increasing inequality of wealth, of income, and of political clout. And so when you get to this tipping point of inequality, then you get this what I call a great pushback coming from both the left and the right. I mean, this is most of the movements in this age right now that are pushing back against the Trump administration are coming from the left. But the age of citizen power long precedes the 2016 presidential election, and Occupy Wall Street was a part of that, but so was the Tea Party, at least in its early phases, right? And I think recognizing the surge of interest and appeal that libertarianism is picking up, particularly among young people, is also part of this great pushback against the sense that you're describing, Jim, that the game is rigged, that there are people in charge who are trying to take advantage of me. I think what people have always recognized that there are folks in charge, and in an age maybe half a century ago when people began to realize that, the people in charge aren't actually looking out for our interests. The people in charge are lying about war. The people in charge are taking advantage of the fact that nobody's paying attention to corruption into public office. Half a century ago, 4 decades ago, people started to realize that you couldn't just assume that those in charge had the best interests at heart. But I think, again, these last 4 or 5 decades of compounding are what I think are really making people wake up today and realize, okay, like if we want to have any semblance of an American dream now, if we want to actually believe that there's equal justice under law and that we have a fair shot in society, it's time to start challenging concentrated, monopolized power in all its forms. And that's what we're seeing across the culture and across politics right now.
A boiling point has been reached? Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, look, in a way, we can thank Donald Trump. I mean, he alone, as he likes to say, has been responsible for the greatest surge of civic engagement and civic participation this country has seen in half a century. And that boiling point is partly, as I say, turned up and accelerated by his behavior and the actions of his administration. But that boil began well before the 2016 election, right? And I think that sense of resentment, that sense of the game being rigged, that sense that, again, to use this kind of language that Bernie Sanders fans and Donald Trump fans would have agreed with, which is there are elites out there in establishments who are laughing at us while they rig the game against us. That sense, that fear, that creeping kind of conspiratorial idea, which is rooted in reality, is something that people across the left and the right are waking up to. And I think that's why we are at this boiling point, which isn't going to, even if Donald Trump were to leave office tomorrow, this boiling point, we'd still be at a boil. And I think the fact is that both major parties have only begun to reckon with this. And again, institutions well outside of partisan politics. You think about the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement is not just a thing that happened because the internet made it possible, and not just a thing that happened because some great Pulitzer Prize winning reporters who were very enterprising told stories that had been kept under wraps for a long time. It's happening because, again, society is at this boiling point in the sense of, to use another metaphor, the sense of contagion, that people are realizing that we don't have to just take it anymore. We don't have to just accept as a given, a workplace or society where women are just routinely harassed and where those are the norms. We actually have the power to change norms. And that's what's happening. That's what's happening, I believe, with Black Lives Matter. People are changing norms. And though there's great controversy and not yet consensus about those three simple words, Black Lives Matter, the fact is that those activists have begun to force a different kind of conversation about Black life, about the ways in which the institutions of our society in policing, criminal justice, and well beyond devalue Black life. And so norms are shifting in ways that I think are also part of this great pushback, even apart from party politics.
We're speaking with Eric Liu, founder and CEO of Citizen University, of course, author of numerous books. His most recent is titled You're More Powerful Than You Think, A Citizen's Guide to Making Change Happen. Eric, how do you convince someone they have power when they feel the opposite?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a fundamental one. And I think there's a couple of things. Again, when you actually name power, when I talk about power, I described it earlier as a capacity to ensure that others do as you would like them to do. It breaks down to several sources of power, right? Many people feel powerless today because their first place to go to is money. Money is one form of power, one source of power. And it is true that more Americans, as the middle class evaporates, are feeling anxious about whether they have money power. But money isn't the only form of power, right? People power is a form of power. And I think if you look around the country in recent months at the waves of teachers who are organizing in red states, in West Virginia, in Oklahoma, in Arizona, all these places, teachers are remembering that they have power that they've been giving away for many years, and that when they actually mobilize and organize each other, they're able to create brand new power out of thin air, right? The ability to organize and to organize direct action generates power where it did not previously exist. And so that's something I would tell folks who feel powerless. But even apart from people power and the organizing of other humans, again, when we were talking earlier about Me Too or something like that, I would remind people who are feeling powerless that, social norms are another source of power for you as a citizen. And your ability to set off a contagion that changes social norms is equal to anybody else's, right? Black Lives Matter or the Fight for 15 or Me Too, these were not hashtags or movements that were started by billionaires or political elites. They were started by everyday Americans who had been feeling and were able to name a feeling of powerlessness and were saying through their hashtags and through their other forms of activism, enough. It's time to change these norms about what we think is okay in our society. And all of these contagious movements have caught fire because other people realize that, holy cow, I also have the power to change a definition of what's okay, right? You think about how a decade ago, marriage equality was just, even in the Democratic Party, was not understood as a norm. That was not understood as a universal goal, even among Democrats. And here we are today where that is a social norm, certainly among Democrats, among a large and increasing swath of Republicans and independents. And certainly it's the law of the land now, right? And so your ability to change norms, like your ability to mobilize people, and your ability to actually tell a different story about who we are, about what we're doing, all of these are available to you, even if you don't have a big bank account, even if you're not connected to insiders. And I think that's the affirmative way of saying it, Jim. I think that the perhaps more urgent negative way to say it, and I often say this in the context of voting, because a lot of people I encounter are like, hey, what does it matter who I vote for, or whether I even show up to vote? Like, the game is rigged, I hate my choices, I don't want to participate in this corrupt game. And my answer to them in that context is this. There's no such thing as not voting. Not voting is voting. Not voting is voting to hand your power over to somebody else who has no qualms about exercising your power in your name, in your voice, and oftentimes against your interests. And so when you think that the game is rigged and you decide not to vote or to show up, you're ensuring that it's going to be rigged, right? And I think that that more negative formulation that not showing up condemns you is a counterpart to the affirmative version, which is showing up changes the game, right?
Yeah.
And when we show up in numbers, we totally change the game. And I think that's people have felt that physically, palpably in the last year of marches, March for Our Lives, and the Women's March, and the Science March. Where people are palpably realizing I'm not alone, I'm not isolated, and when I join with others, I create brand new power out of thin air.
And I like your when I hear it makes me cringe when I hear somebody say I'm not going to vote for whatever reason they're not going to vote. And I like your example of, hey, you're just voting to give somebody else your power. Your book also gives us examples of people taking power. Tell us about Kansas City.
Well, in Kansas City, the story that I tell there is about this pretty remarkable group of community activists, clergy, leaders from the clergy, who were not just content to be part of the fight for 15 and to push for a minimum wage on making economic arguments, but they really began to change the frame of the debate altogether by pushing for what they called a moral economy. This was catalyzed by an organization in Kansas City called CCO, Communities Creating Opportunity, that brings together faith leaders from all different denominations and across the race spectrum and divide in a pretty segregated Kansas City. And what they did was to mobilize both these faith leaders and the congregations, as well as others who have been thinking themselves as bystanders, people who are low-wage workers, people who are on the short end of the economic stick, and they began to organize them using a different kind of narrative, right? And the narrative wasn't just about raising the wage so that people could put food on the table. The narrative was about what does it mean actually to live in a moral society? What does it mean to have a moral economy? And the economy and the marketplace are not a zone where you get to just put aside all notions of fairness. But actually, if you believe in a language of faith, if you actually have and live and practice a religious approach to the world, then you are required actually to understand that something like the fight for 15 or something like the push for Medicaid expansion are not just about public policy choices or wonky choices or economic decisions. They are about deciding that we're part of a moral community. And CCO was so effective in mobilizing communities of color, low-income communities to participate and show up in ways that they hadn't before. And that's one example of what I talk about in this book, Jim. I think there are, just to rewind a bit, I talk about there being three laws of power. And with those three laws come three imperatives for action. And law number one, which we've talked about already here, is that power compounds, right? We feel that today painfully in this age of inequality. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, but also those who have some clout get more clout. Those who get a little bit of attention tend to get more attention, right? That is the way of the world and has always been the way of the world, but it's accelerated in an age of inequality with the technology that we have today. So number one, power compounds. Law number two is that power justifies itself. At every turn, incumbent holders of power, whether they are individuals or institutions, will spin elaborate narratives, try to explain to everybody else why this is the God-given order of things, right? And one of one big example of that relates to Kansas City is the storyline of trickle-down economics, which is not based on economic fact. It has no actual theory, a basis in empirical economic results, but it's a fairy tale, and it's a story that says you got to take care of the rich, the so-called job creators, because if you pay them tribute, if you worship them, if you give them tax cuts and tax breaks, then they will be kind to the rest of us, and their prosperity will leak its way down to the rest of us, right? That's a story. That's an explanation it comes from. It happens to be completely wrong, but you can't beat something with nothing. One of the things that you realize is that when you look at trickle-down economics, it is a pure story of self-justification. It is those with wealth trying to explain to everybody else why they ought to be content with what they got and why they ought to be patient with those with wealth and why those with wealth ought to be less burdened by taxes and regulation. And so that's an example of law number two. If all we had were laws number one and number two, we would be stuck in this pretty grim doom loop, right? Where fewer and fewer people are hoarding and monopolizing power and trying to tell everybody else why they ought to be happy about it. What breaks us out of that doom loop and what saves us from it is law number three. And that is this: power is infinite. And I want people to listen to this and sit with us a minute, right? I'm not some new age dude from Seattle trying to sell you some kind of woo-woo idea that if you just manifest power, it appears. I mean this. In civic life, it is wholly possible power out of thin air through the magic act of organizing. Power is infinite. And we live in an age right now where people who are longtime activists and people who are brand new to the whole game of democracy are discovering law number three, that they can generate new power out of thin air, right? And so when you have these three laws, you realize, well, if in the first place power is always concentrating, compounding into these winner-take-all monopolized games, then our first job as citizens is to change the game. If in the second place, power holders are always spinning narratives about why things are the way they are and ought to be the way they are, then our second imperative is to change the story. And if in the third place, power is infinite, and yet so many people remain stuck in this zero-sum idea that the game is rigged against me, I can never get more, I can't generate power, then we've got to change the equation, right? And in Kansas City, those folks at Communities Creating Opportunity were doing all three of these imperatives, Jim. They changed the game by mobilizing communities that had been neglected in politics and in community organizing. They changed the story by making this fight not just about wages and dollars and cents, but about the idea of a moral economy, which could awaken people both on the right and the left who had a religious and faith-based approach to public life. And they changed the equation by mobilizing brand new folks into the game of politics in a way that enabled them to pass $15 minimum wage and a living wage. Now, that's not the end of the story. The conservative, the Republican legislature in Missouri then preempted Kansas City and knocked them back down. But that's an ongoing fight. And it's an ongoing fight in our country on all these issues. But being aware of these three laws and these three imperatives gives you a sense that it's not just a big bloom of confusion out there. You can actually make a difference, and you can actually you can actually change the frame of the possible in politics.
For someone who's just starting out, what is your advice to taking the first steps to realizing power?
Jim, I think that's a super important question. And I often use three simple words, which is this: join a club. It doesn't matter what the club is. It can be, something super political that's, the kind of thing that has emerged in this kind of contagious way I've talked about, like Indivisible, right? Indivisible chapters are in over 6,000 places around the United States, in every congressional district in the country. And that started out of a Google document right after the Trump administration took power. You can join a club like that is all about politics and about resistance and about progressive political action. Or, frankly, you can join a gardening club or join a neighborhood club or join a book club. The reason why I say join a club is that we Americans over the last 4 or 5 decades have let our citizen muscles atrophy. We have stopped joining. We've stopped participating in things that are bigger than ourselves. We've forgotten what it means to actually join up with a group of people and meet them on a regular basis. Have to kind of come up with common agendas, with common goals and common plans. Have to negotiate and navigate all the differences of opinion and the differing priorities within a group. Again, whether it can be a gardening club that wants to plant here versus plant there, or it can be a political club that wants to lobby here versus lobby there. But that kind of exercise of flexing that muscle, what it means to bring people together and have to work through that stuff. These are habits that Americans have forgotten over the last 4 or 5 decades. And number one thing we got to do right now is just to join a club, And I think when you do that, I think the corollary to that, because a lot of people I talk to are like, gosh, there's so many issues during the age of Trump where I could get involved. I could help, defend refugees and immigrants, or I could work on making sure there's environmental rules in place, or I could work on this or that. Where do I begin? And my answer to that part of the question, I don't mean to sound glib, but my answer is pick anything. It really doesn't matter. Pick anything. Pick one thing right now and just commit to yourself that for the next 6 to 9 months, you're going to go deep on that issue. It might be refugees. It might be climate change. It might be homelessness. It might be something hyper-local. Pick anything. And if you just say, on that issue, I'm going to go deep. I'm going to join a club. I'm going to get smart on the issue. I'm going to read about it. I'm going to understand what people are arguing about on this issue. And that becomes, on that one particular issue, a larger proxy for how you start to rebuild your whole capacity as a citizen. That's the only way right now that we got to get off this idea that participating in politics just means watching the news, being spectators, clicking likes, or retweeting things on social media. That's spectatordom. That's not citizenship. And we are in an age right now where if we're going to save this republic, it's all citizens on deck. And we actually got to be more than spectators.
Engagement. Just get engaged, people. That's how you do it. That's how you start it off. Hey, before we let you go, Eric, when you look at politics today, do you feel it has the resiliency to keep working in the interest of true democracy?
Jim, I'm people often ask, am I an optimist or a pessimist? And, to your question, I'm not sure optimism, pessimism is the right frame. I suppose I am somewhat optimistic, but the way I put it is more that I'm hopeful. Optimism, is a thing that where you just think things are going to work out. And optimism almost absolves you and others of actually having to do anything to make things work out, right? Optimism is appropriate for things where you don't have any control. Like, I'm optimistic as a kid who grew up in New York and a Yankee fan. I'm optimistic the Yankees are actually going to do well this year. Okay, great. I have nothing to do with that, but that's my optimism based on my reading of the situation, right? But hope actually requires you to have a hand in making the thing happen, right? And so I am hopeful actually about the resilience of the body politic. When I talked earlier about this surge of civic engagement that's happened since Trump took office, that is literally and figuratively the immune system of the body politic kicking in, right? When people were swarming to airports the day that the Muslim ban was announced, that was like antibodies to a virus, as people have been marching and people have been converting the marches then into voter registration, and you have record numbers of young people, of women, of scientists running for office right now. That is the immune system responding to a virus of, again, the virus is not republicanism. The virus is Trumpism. The virus is this kind of authoritarian, anti-democratic, reckless, anti-rule of law approach to governing a society. That's one part of the body politic, the immune system kicking in. But the other part has actually less to do with Trump or anything Trump is doing. And that is just, my friends Jim and Deb Fallows, I'm going to plug someone else's book here actually for a second. They've got a new book out called Our Towns. Jim is a longtime correspondent for the Atlantic magazine. Many moons ago, he was a speechwriter for Jimmy Carter, and he and I have been friends for many years. And he and his wife Deb, who's a writer and an author, they spent a few years traveling across the United States in their own little, single-engine prop plane, going to small and medium towns. The story that they tell is of dual problem-solving, people inside the kind of insane part of it, just fixing stuff in San Bernardino, just fixing stuff in Greenville, South Carolina. In our work at Citizen University, Jim, we do programs and projects all around the United States in towns red and blue, small and big, And I see the same thing. I see a lot of people who are hungering not only for decency in this age of indecent politics, but they're hungering for problem solving in an age where national politicians are just about throwing talking points at each other, not actually doing anything. And from the bottom up, there is this kind of web of civic renewal that I see happening. Is it coming fast enough to save us? I don't know. But this is why I say I'm hopeful.
And we can all remain hopeful. Eric Liu, founder and CEO.
I have something to do with that answer.
What's that? Say that again?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, we got to stay hopeful, and what that means is we got to stay engaged.
Absolutely. 100% agree. Eric Liu, founder and CEO of Citizen University, also the author of numerous books, and his latest, You're More Powerful Than You Think, A Citizen's Guide to Making Change Happen. Eric, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Thanks for having me.
You're quite welcome. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with author Jeff Weaver on the lasting impact of Bernie Sanders and why the revolution has only just begun.
You want to know what happened in 2016? We've told you earlier about a great book by John Allen and Amy Parnes called Shattered. But the latest and the best of all is this new book called How Bernie Won, by Bernie's campaign manager, Jeff Weaver, who joins us in studio. Good friend, great job. Hello, Jeff. Good to see you.
Hey, Bill. Great to be here. Listen, let me just bounce off what you just said about the teachers. They are really leading the fight for labor rights right now across the country.
Aren't they?
Incredible.
Yeah. No, I mean, to see them in Kentucky and West Virginia and Colorado, right? And now North Carolina, state by state, and having an impact.
Yes. And well, I mean, this just goes to show what you and I think, long have known, and the senator has long known that, there are working class people in red states also, and they need our help.
Boy, yeah, absolutely. How Bernie won. Jeff, I hate to break it to you, but Bernie didn't win. Did he?
Didn't he, Bill? Didn't he? I was at a press conference earlier in the U.S. Senate, and I worked with Bernie on the Hill for 14 years. And I saw almost every person talked about as a leading contender for president of the United States standing at Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All press conference. Certainly not something that would have happened a couple of years ago.
Boy, you know it, right?
$15 minimum wage. It's in the Democratic Party platform. Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders came together where she adopted largely his free tuition at public colleges and universities plan, to her credit. States are starting to move in that direction all over the country. You've seen it in Rhode Island. You've seen it even in New York State. So did Bernie win? Yeah, I think in many ways what Bernie set out to do, he did, which is to mobilize the grassroots of this country and to turn the conversation back to a more rational direction.
I remember when in our early conversations with you and with Bernie, I mean, these are ideas, bold ideas that he felt had the Democratic Party had to be part of the dialogue in 2016. The Democratic Party had to embrace, had sort of gotten away from their base. And to that extent, he achieved all of that.
Yes, and you're starting to see stories now trying to separate Bernie from what we're seeing around the country, which is primary candidates at the local level, state level, at the federal level, are running on his platform, right? And now the media is trying to say, well, but Bernie won't be part of that, or he won't be the leader of that. But let's be clear, he inspired that across this country. He made it possible for other people to advocate for those policies. And the political revolution, as he called it, is really sweeping across the country.
Another front that you talk about, and it was a big part of the campaign, were reforms, changes in policies, but also reforms in the Democratic primary system.
Yes.
Particularly as engineered by the DNC.
Well, look, I mean, it's no secret to your listeners that there was a heavy hand on the scales for Hillary Clinton by the Democratic National Committee during the campaign. There's no doubt about that. Debbie Wasserman Schultz has been exposed over and over again as having operated against the campaign. Donna Brazile, in her book, which I also recommend to folks, laid out how the Clinton campaign had effective control of the DNC from the summer of 2015, long before the primaries were really even engaged. And so...
And the emails that came out...
proved
the case. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And again, Donna exposed that contract that was signed between the DNC and the Clinton campaign. So, look, that happened. There's no doubt about it. And we've got to make sure that does not happen again. The people who should choose who the nominee of the Democratic Party is going to be is the rank-and-file voters who go out to the primaries and caucuses. They should be the arbiters of who is the party's nominee.
And what's strange about that is that's the way the Republican Party works.
Well, and I'm going to...
They don't have superdelegates, for example.
Exactly. And I'm going to say something that's... and I don't want people to take it the wrong way because, I despise everything that Trump stands for. But Trump was nominated through a process, as you point out, without superdelegates, without insiders with their fingers on the scale. And we had a process where Hillary Clinton was largely supported by the establishment of the Democratic Party, which had a heavy hand in picking the nominee. And their process produced, empirically, the more electable candidate, right? The people
look where he is today. I mean, you can't dispute the fact, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, if you want to pick the candidate, you want to pick the candidate that voters are going to pick in November, have them pick in the primary, right?
Right. So the battle goes on, right? Over closed primaries, superdelegates, other issues like that. Same day voter registration. I know there's the Reform Commission, but where are we today?
Well, the Unity Reform Commission on which I served, and it was a commission that was established through negotiations between our campaign and Hillary's campaign,
leading into the convention.
Exactly, and it was we had minority representation on the committee. But it came out with a number of important reforms, including reducing the number of superdelegates by at least 60%. Some moves to make sure that more people could participate. We didn't quite get open primaries, but we did get some major changes. And, that's now before the Democratic Party's Rules and Bylaws Committee. I have to say, to his credit, Tom Perez has been advocating very strongly for the reforms that came out of the Unity Reform Commission. So I give him a lot of credit for that, along with Keith Ellison, the vice chair of the party, has been as well. And so we will see how this comes out. The question will be, at the end of the day, will party insiders let the grassroots have the power that they deserve?
Right. And Larry Cohen has been...
Larry Cohen was the vice chair of the URC, Unity Reform Commission. And he did a fantastic job. He's a good friend of mine, obviously.
Right, indeed. How tough was it? And before reading your book, I didn't know about this historic meeting the night of the District of Columbia primary, where the summit meeting between Hillary and Bernie. You were there. Jane was there. Mrs. Sanders. John Podesta and Robbie Mook, as I recall, right?
Yes, the six of us were in a suite in the Washington Hilton. It was quite a meeting, as a matter of fact, and it was really laid the foundation, Bill, for the cooperation that you saw.
So, but at this point, you knew that mathematically it was over, right?
Yes.
This was the very last primary. Bernie had pledged he'd go all the way through to the last primary. So this was the first meeting between the two candidates. Once the outcome was definitely known, right? So take it from there.
Absolutely. Look, he had. It was clear we didn't have the pledged delegates we needed. The secretary had hung on through the end, and so there was no prospect at that point that superdelegates were going to flip to Bernie. And he had pledged to go to the end. He did. He also pledged at the beginning that he would support the Democratic nominee, which I know was disappointing to some people, but he did make that pledge at the very beginning, and he did. And so at that point, the question became, how can we best advance the policy agenda that Bernie had laid out during the campaign? How could we create as much enduring change out of the campaign as we could from a policy standpoint? Because I think at that point, everybody, including Donald Trump, thought that Hillary Clinton was going to be the next president of the United States. So we decided to meet face-to-face in this powwow, and the media knew about it. There was a huge media stakeout
really?
at the front of out in the front of the hotel, as you can imagine.
I bet. Yeah.
And so we agreed to arrive separately. So we arrived first, and we went to this sort of converted hotel suite the Clinton people had arranged.
Did you go in the front door?
We went right through the front door. Absolutely.
Oh.
Yeah, Bernie's not going through the back, skulk around the back door. We went right in through the front door. And we waited there. And we sort of, Bernie's not really, you read about it in the book, Bernie's not really a sitter. So we sort of paced around
until she gets there.
Yeah, so she gets there. And we were sort of, when she got there, we were sort of at the back of the suite. And so they kind of came into an empty room, really. And then, so I was in the front. I walked up and shook the secretary's hand and congratulated her. She asked how I was. And, it was obviously these had been two people who had competed vigorously against one another. But frankly, despite
they've known each other a long time.
Yes, they have. And, Bernie often spoke during the campaign about how much he liked on a personal level and respected her and her accomplishments. And so there was not, a campaign wears on you, and there is this sort of organizational imperative to win, and that sort of takes over. But on a personal level, I think both of them understood that the primary was over and that there was a new challenge ahead that had to be confronted and defeated. Unfortunately, it was not defeated. And so I thought there was a good faith effort on both parts to sit down and try to find out where there would be common ground that they could work together on in order to unify the party and unify the country. And we had a long list of things, asks that we had, and some of them were policy issues, which I thought would be harder, and some were more political, like getting rid of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, for instance, which the secretary at that point was not willing to do. But on policy, to my surprise, we did find some common ground around college affordability. And around issues of health care. She was not willing to come on a single payer, but she was willing to support a public option under the President Obama's program, as well as expanding Medicare to people down to 55 and a bunch of other reforms that Bernie had requested. So I thought it was a really great meeting. She was obviously not feeling well at the meeting. She had a kind of a cough, and she was eating a lot of Ricolas. And, I know the Republicans, for their own sick reasons, tried to make it out that she had some medical problem. But, it was a grueling campaign. And I have to tell you that over long periods, and you can read in the book how during the Nevada caucuses, I was laid up in bed in a casino hotel. Las Vegas can be a fun place. It's not a great place to be sick, by the way, for your information, folks. But, I really saw it as a strength, an indication of her sort of strength and perseverance that she was pushing on, even though she was obviously not feeling well. So kudos to her for that.
Right. Again, the book, a great book by Jeff Weaver, Inside the Revolution, How Bernie Won. Great photo of Jeff and the senator on the back. When, during the campaign, did you realize that this could be more than just a message campaign?
Yeah, well...
at some point, and I think with the senator, too, you realize... Holy mackerel, this thing is really taken off, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, obviously in this...
Was there any one point where you...
Well, obviously the night of the Iowa caucuses was, that was the first vote, right? The first time where people actually went and voted. I mean, there'd been a lot of polling, and we had done polling, and you can read in the book about
so hard
the machinations to get a pollster on our campaign, which is not easy. No. But the Iowa caucuses where we, it was essentially a tie. It was the closest ever in Iowa caucus history. And that was the night that we knew. And Robbie Mook, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, described that to me, after the campaign as the worst night for him of their campaign. So, and I think that because that's probably the night that they also realized that it was a real thing and not just a flash in the pan.
Well, how about the size of the crowds? Was it like Madison, Wisconsin, or?
Well, Madison, Wisconsin was the first 10,000 person crowd. Phenomenal.
So here he is, bigger crowds than anybody presidential candidate
exactly
had gotten, and he's brand new, never run before, not even a Democrat until he starts running.
Right. Well, what was phenomenal, Bill, and this is also a theme throughout the book, is the role that the media played in this whole thing, and this whole issue of crowds is interesting because. He started with big crowds. He had 5,000 people at his announcement in Burlington, Vermont, which is as many people as Hillary Clinton had in New York City, which is obviously a much bigger municipality than Burlington, Vermont, for those of you who've been to Burlington.
As you point out.
And but every time there would be some indications of strength, the media would downplay it. So first it was just, okay, it's only in Vermont. And then it was only in the Northeast. And then it was only in Frost Belt states. Mm-hmm. And, we would go to Arizona and get 10,000, 12,000 people, right? So then it was... after a while, they couldn't figure out what was going on because it couldn't be that Bernie was doing well. So then it was, well, these people will come out to see him, but they won't come out to vote. Well, and that's why Iowa was so important, because it showed that, in fact, people would come out to vote for Bernie in the campaign.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It did turn out. And also in terms of, I remember, and you talk about those two, a couple of the early meetings at our house.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
We just about a block from here.
Yes. This is Bill, for the record, Bill Press was involved in the campaign before I was. Let me say that because I didn't come
Bernie
on.
hired you, right?
Yeah, right.
This campaign, although you guys had spent a lot of time working together on other campaigns.
Yeah. Well, I've worked for Bernie for most of my adult life, since 1980, almost continuously since 1986, with a few short breaks. So, but on this campaign, Bill, for the record, you were there before I was.
Proud to have been there, but I remember those early meetings where one question always came up. Okay, running for president is going to cost a lot of money. How much money do you think we could raise? And Tad Devine, our good friend, right, who was an advisor, whatever, did the media.
Absolutely, yeah, and much more. And Tad and Mark Longabaugh and Julian Mulvey, the partners over at DML, they did media, but they did so much more than media.
Yeah, and Bernie had asked him to put up like a little outline about what do you think we could do, and it was always sort of, $5 million or maybe $50 million. I mean, the money must have blown away, the money you were able to raise online.
Yeah, no, it was incredible, Bill. And as we talk about in the book, the biggest unknown in the campaign was how much money we would be able to raise, and it drove a lot of the early functioning of the campaign, because we just did not know. By then, Bernie announced in the Senate swamp on the end of April, with sort of unconventional announcement.
Almost as if it was a pain in the ass for him to have to do it, right?
Right, exactly. And by the end of July, we had, less than 30 people on staff nationwide, right? And, the Clinton campaign had hundreds and hundreds of people on staff, and people all over the country. So we had a very lean staff, and that was partly driven by the fact that we did not know how much money we were going to be able to raise, and Bernie was committed to go the whole way. And so we had to make sure that we had the resources to do that.
And you ended up, as I recall, 231 or 235?
Yeah, right, exactly. And it was almost all online, and it was vast majority, as you know, was small dollar contributions.
And we all know the average contribution was $27. $27, right? That became...
right. I mean, what was fun by the end of the campaign is that the crowds knew the stump speech, right? And so they would actually give parts of it along with Bernie, right? Or he could ask them a question about what was coming next in the speech, and they would all scream it out. So, the level of excitement from people at these rallies was really phenomenal.
Well, it was, particularly given the fact, as you point out in the book, that Bernie gave the same stump speech at every rally, and it was like an hour long.
Yeah. Oh, no. Well, it started at about an hour and 15, and by the end of the campaign, because things would be added to it, but it was difficult to get anything out of it. So it would go an hour and 45, 2 hours.
And the crowds were really into
it. They stayed the whole time. They were engrossed the whole time. And for those people who think that people can only digest things in 30-second sound bites, let me assure you that people will enthusiastically receive a 2-hour political speech, unapologetic political speech, with great excitement.
Where does this, and you end up here in the book, I thought some of the strongest parts of the book at the very end of the book, where you look forward to what challenges you think facing the Democratic Party, and then challenges for 2020 for Senator Sanders. So let's start with the Democratic Party.
Look, the Democratic Party, and the book tries to put the 2016 race in a historical context of the Democratic Party, which with its modern roots in the New Deal, and how in an aberrational shift to the right in the 90s, the Democratic Party lost its way, and lost its connection, its real connection with much of the grassroots which had supported the party, since the New Deal, and how Bernie's campaign, in many ways, was a much bigger contest within the party between those people who are majority of the party, frankly, who want to put the Democratic Party back on its historical trajectory of a party supporting greater inclusion, greater opportunity, and those who want to cling to the failed experiment of the 90s, with a corporatist leaning, narrow political triangulation, often against some of the most vulnerable parts of our constituencies. And that fight played out in 2016. And where the party has to go forward in order to be successful is it really has to fully re-embrace its modern historical roots in the New Deal. I put in, if people read the book, there's the entirety of FDR's
speech.
His 1944 State of the Union, which my publisher said, don't put that in there. It's too long and boring. People won't read it. And I said, by God, it's going in the book because this is really the foundational document of the modern Democratic Party and the work that has been left undone since the New Deal. And it's the work that we have to get done. And if we can convince the American people that that's the work we're trying to get done, they will come back to us in droves.
And what does Bernie do? And you are a senior political advisor to Senator Sanders. Has Bernie decided to run in 2020, and do you think he should?
He has not decided to run yet. It is under active consideration. The book does end with the 3 words, run, Bernie, run. So my position on this is pretty clear. I think he is the person at this moment in history who is best able to do what I just described, which is to reconnect the Democratic Party with its historical modern roots, to articulate, when you talk to voters, regardless of where they are or what race they are, and you ask what they want in life, the answers are strikingly similar when you poll people. They want a good economic life. They want health care. They want their children to have a better life than they have had. They want their parents to be taken care of. They want to live a life of social dignity. So we have got to articulate a vision that motivates those people, but we've also got to address all of the specific barriers which keep different communities from attaining that common aspiration.
And Jeff Weaver says again in How Bernie Won, Bernie is the man. Run, Bernie, run.
That's all for America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Pedro Noguera, Eric Liu, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.